If you're watching this video, I think it's fair to say that you love football. And if you have even the slightest knowledge of the beautiful game, you'll know that in 1800s Britain, the game we currently know as football was founded. Except there is another year which could claim to have birthed the modern game. This is 1992, the year football was reborn.
Anyone who's ever played the game at any level.
John Jensen off.
The three clips you've just seen hold far more importance than you may ever have known, but before I explain why, let me set the scene of football in the 80s. Violence and crime amongst fans was rife, particularly in England, where despite still being by far the most popular sport on the planet, football was looked down upon by many. Sure, it had conquered Europe and South America as well as significant parts of Africa, but given its most sought after tournament was called the World Cup, I think it's fair to say it still had a lot to do if it wanted to truly be classified as a global sport. And so, in order to reach this goal, a sequence of events happened which would completely change the landscape of the beautiful game forever. Firstly, 1990 saw Italy host the World Cup, which is really the spark that would go on to ignite football's explosion in the decade. At the time, Italian football was by far the best in the world. From Maradona to Baggio, Van Basten and Gullit to Rijkaard and Matthäus, Serie A saw the best players in the world in every position, every week, and so the tournament would be the perfect opportunity to show the wider world why football was so special. And despite the fact that there was a good few boring games that tend to be overlooked, culturally speaking, this might just have been the greatest, or at least the most important, World Cup of all time. From Cameroon defeating world champions Argentina to Romania and Costa Rica both shocking the world and qualifying out of their groups in second place, the minuscule number of goals scored wasn't enough to stop a wider audience from being captivated by the beautiful game, and so for various executives around the world, this was the perfect time to innovate and take advantage of the situation. And so that brings us to 1992. Jeans were baggy but football shorts were short, Whitney Houston topped the charts and Michael Jackson wanted to heal the world, but more importantly we saw numerous changes which would go on to change football forever. After 93 years of being one of Europe's biggest and best clubs, Barcelona finally won their first ever European Cup, which would funnily enough be their last ever edition of the competition before it be rebranded to the Champions League. You see, despite football being founded as a working man's sport over a century prior, by the 90s it was clear to many that it could potentially become a very viable business model, and so Europe's biggest competition was the perfect place to start. At the time, clubs in the competition were able to choose their own sponsors, held their own TV rights, and games were played at a time which suited the home fans the best, meaning for people on a different side of the continent, a game wouldn't exactly be played at prime viewing time, meaning TV deals were far from lucrative. And so UEFA decided something had to be changed. They then took control of sponsors on the side of the pitch, the way prize money was distributed, and more importantly the times of kickoffs, which were then placed at 8:45 Central European time. This final change was probably the most important as it allowed UEFA to pull in far better TV deals, as games across Europe would now pull in a far higher viewership.
Anyone who's ever played the game at any level will know.
Take a look at that trophy there. Some of you watching may recognise it as the one given to the winners of the championship who go on to be promoted to the Premier League. However, before 1992 this was actually the most important piece of silverware in English football, as it marked the winners of England's Division 1. But in 1991 the big five English teams decided change had to be made. Despite the fact that football had been created in England and the country saw plenty of European success across the late 70s and early 80s, a ban from European competition, poor infrastructure and just simply a lack of money had meant that English sides struggled massively to bring in sponsors and players. Italy and Spain had all the top stars, and I mean, if you're a South American player, why move to Bradford when you can instead go to Barcelona and earn more money? However, enough was enough, and by 1992 the big English sides had managed to convince the others to create a new breakaway division, in which the clubs had far more control over the way it was run. Before this change, Liverpool earned the same amount of TV money as sides like Leyton Orient, and fast forward 30 years I think it's fair to say it might be a little bit different. To put it simply, a very similar process to that of the Champions League happened at the same time in England, as kick-off times had changed to broadcast as many games as possible as focus shifted on the international TV deals instead of match-going fans. Fast forward to 2023 and the Premier League is by far the biggest and best league in the world in terms of quality and more importantly finances, and I'm sure all of you watching know more than enough about it. And any of you who are good at maths and understand the importance of even numbered years in relation to football will have worked out that 1992 would of course see a major international tournament over the summer, keeping eyes on the sport during football's huge break, and it just so happened this year would see arguably international football's greatest ever achievement. Having originally qualified for the competition, Yugoslavia would be barred from playing at Euro 92 just 13 days before it started, and so UEFA decided that the team who finished below them in qualification should take their place instead, that team being Denmark. The Danes had been drawn into the group of death, facing up against both France and England, and after 2 games they had just 1 point on the board. Mix into this their best player literally refusing to play under their manager, and it looked like Denmark would be heading home. Except something remarkable then happened. A win on the final day against France meant that the 2 big boys in the group would end up being knocked out, and Denmark were through to the next round despite having not even qualified for the tournament. They would then knock out the reigning champions, the Netherlands, on penalties in the semi-finals before beating a star-studded Germany side in the final to win the whole thing, despite, as I mentioned, having failed to even qualify for it. This was truly the most remarkable story international football had seen in a very long time, if not ever. However, arguably the most important aspect of this story wasn't even their success, and more so what took place in the last minute. This was the final ever time a goalkeeper would be able to pick up a back pass to them from their own teammate. Following the conclusion of the Euros that year, back passes would be banned, as for years and years they'd been used to waste time, generally making a game a lot more dull for anyone watching, as time and time again a keeper would pick the ball up with his hands and run down the clock. And therefore this change in rule meant that goalkeepers had to become a lot better with their feet. Overnight, high pressing systems suddenly became far more viable as teams looked to pounce upon potential errors a team made when playing out from the back, where in the late 2000s former Barcelona captain Pep Guardiola built one of, if not the, greatest ever football team upon these simple principles. Barcelona's players had to be able to press high, and just as importantly they needed to be able to play out from the back, and the next 15 years saw nearly every single team copy these principles to a certain extent, and so the knock-on effect of this rule change partnered with the commercialisation of football meant that the year 1992 well and truly changed football forever.